Well, it's always great to talk to Daniel Estulin. He is compelling. Sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what he's talking about. You have to go back and kind of reread it. It's some heavy stuff. He's an investigative journalist, and he digs into the long process that led to Donald Trump to become president. In his new book, In the Shadows of a Presidency, he kind of gives a behind-the-scenes story of all the actors involved, governments, companies, institutions involved, and plus, what are the payout? What's the payoff for the insiders that helped Trump? He is a Russian ex-spy and other credentials from the man. He's the one who wrote the book, the bestseller, The True Story of the Bilderbergers. He was a part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Russian Federation, and the list goes on and on. It's great to have you on the program again.
It's wonderful to be back. I'm not so much of a spy. I don't want people thinking I'm some kind of a James Bond-like character. Rather, I'm an analyst from a point of view of conceptual intelligence, which basically means we create models that can explain the future of humanity about 50 years in advance.
Yeah, well, you've hit on some incredible subjects, and sometimes you have to stop and think, rewind the tape, listen to what you said again, and kind of digest it. But let's get right into it. It is just an amazing story. We could talk about the election coverage, the election results from last night, but let's get into overall, how did he get there? How did this all happen?
It's a very good question. You have to remember that between 1944, I'm not going to go back to the 19th century and bore people with economic models, but between 1944 and between 1991, there were two economic models fighting each other for control. One was created in 1944 called the Bretton Woods model, and was created by the people, organizations, and countries who won World War II. And that was a capitalist Western model. And the other model was a socialist communist bloc led by the Soviet Union and the satellite nations. And these two models, they coexisted fairly evenly between 1944 and 1991. Economically speaking, West and the United States had an advantage. Socially speaking, the Soviet bloc had an advantage. Demographically speaking, it was pretty much, even although the Soviet Union had 300 million people at the time, and the United States 200 and something million. But again, they coexisted fairly well. And then in 1991, for reasons which you're not really going to go into right now, the Soviet bloc, not that it collapsed, but rather it merged with the Western capitalist bloc and created this pan-world liberal banking financier model. And so the Western capitalist model was always based on the concept of infinite growth on a finite planet. Well, as we know, you can't grow infinitely. There's always a limit to growth. And because the planet Earth is not an expanding territory, but rather a globe, the Western capitalist system came upon a problem back in the 1970s where suddenly they realized that they were experiencing lack of growth. By winning the war against the Soviet bloc, they expanded their lease on life by another 30 years because they conquered the Soviet territory. So the capitalist bloc controlled 60% of the world. The socialist bloc controlled 40%. Well, between 1991 and about 2008, the Western bloc, capitalist bloc, enjoyed, the benefits of having taken over the Soviet area of influence. But then the problem started because, again, we can go back actually to year 2000 when you had the dot-com collapse. Then in 2008 we had the Lehman Brothers collapse. And what we're seeing right now basically is because there's no more growth and because we're seeing globally economic collapse, which will lead to the dismantling of the system. So Donald Trump, and now we're coming to the President of the United States, basically is a consequence of the collapse of the Bretton Woods economic model, which is a liberal banking financier Wall Street model. When I say liberal banking financiers, whether we talk about this week's elections, I'm not dividing them, Democrats on the one side and the Republicans on the other side, because one of the things that happened in the last elections, Allan, if you remember, is a lot of the key Republicans, such as the Bushes, for example, in the 2016 elections, they voted with Hillary Clinton. So it's not so much, the Republicans against Democrats as it's transversal, because the entire system in the United States and globally is part of this liberal banking financier parasitical model, basically meaning people, bankers, who play with numbers on a computer. So if democracy is the rule of the Democrats, liberalism is the rule of the banking elite. And this is what we're seeing right now. So appearance of someone like Donald Trump, you could call it a black swan event, but it's a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence because, again, the entire system since 1944 globally has been controlled, okay, by this liberal banking financiers, and the only adversary they had between 44 and 91 was the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellites. When that was dismantled, they controlled the entire global system, which is why since 2016, Trump has been feuding with Prime Minister of Canada, with Chancellor of Germany, with the Prime Minister of England, with the President of France, with International Monetary Fund, with World Bank, with World Trade Organization, with NATO alliance, openly feuding with G7. We remember the, now famous. I think they will be famous for as long as we live. That image of Donald Trump sitting with his hands crossed and the G7 or G6 leaders, looking at him, and if looks could kill. So, but the point is, what we have to understand and what the liberal media is trying to convince us that Donald Trump is insane. He's fighting against, the America's best friends. But Donald Trump is the alternative model to the liberal banking financier global parasitical model of infinite growth. So all of these countries, Canada, are models. England, France, Germany, International Monetary Fund, they're not the friends of Donald Trump's United States. They're his enemies.
Well, how did Trump get if you could draw a connection, how Trump got involved in this? Did they ask him to help out? And did Putin and Trump have a relationship where they already knew each other? And maybe there was money with his
Trump
properties?
And Putin are not boyfriend, girlfriend. They're not romantically involved. Donald Trump, and I explained it in the first chapter of my book, in the Shadows of the Presidency, which just came out in the United States, and actually is now in its fifth printing in less than a month. That's how much interest people have in what I have to say in this particular book. And I explained it in my book in the first chapter that back in 2014, at the Dartmouth Conference in Dayton, Ohio, and this was the day off or the day after the midterm elections, in other words, the last midterm elections in 2014, we were sitting around with the American delegates and people, because Dartmouth is a very large, prestigious international conference.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has nothing to do with, with the Ruskies, the Mueller's investigation, which, was not brought up at all during the elections because they know there's nothing there. But the thing is, we were sitting around schmoozing after the conference with the Americans, some of the representatives of former government and European bankers and financiers. And we, meaning, the Russian delegates, were explaining to them how we thought, based on the models we're working on, that in the upcoming 2016 elections, this is going to be the first time where it's not going to be, party against party, but idea against idea and a model against model. And that's why we thought, and we explained to them why, no one from the liberal banking financier circles, and that means no one who supports this Bretton Woods global model, would win the elections. Whether it was Hillary Clinton, whether it was, a Republican representative, because again, it's not about party against party, it's transversal, which is why in this week's midterm elections, a lot of the Republican candidates and also incumbents who are moderates, but they're more liberal than conservative, they lost because, again, these are not, Trump supporters, because, again, it's two different models. So we basically explained to them that no one from that side of the aisle could possibly win the elections. And so we, on the intelligence level, started looking at the alternative candidates who could actually come in and win the elections in 2016. And we basically focused on three candidates. We thought Rand Paul would be a possibility, but then he didn't have the business acumen to actually do this, so we kind of discarded him like an old shoe. And then we were left with two candidates we thought had a really good chance. One was Donald Trump, who's a right-wing conservative. And we explained to the Americans that it didn't really matter whether he had, political experience and foresight. He needed to have, very good business acumen. And basically Trump does, and he's running the United States as if it was personal, corporation. And then the other candidate we thought it would be Bernie Sanders, who's a left-leaning liberal. And he would have won the general elections had it not been for all the shenanigans within the Democratic Party. But in the end, Donald Trump is a representative of an alternative economic model, because the economic construct of infinite growth is dead, and we're seeing it all around us, and it's collapsing not only in the United States but also globally. We knew that these people who have promised this infinite growth to the world and could no longer keep their word will be out of power. It was just a question of finding someone who had an alternative economic model. It's not that Trump has an alternative economic model, because he doesn't. But the thing is, these people understood that or you save the world at the expense of the United States, or you save the United States at the expense of the world. And that's why, again, going back to your question, did someone come up to Trump and, what kind of thing did they have with Putin? People on a supranational level, because, again, if you look at the last elections, Clinton against Trump, who was behind Clinton? Behind Clinton, you had the liberal banking financier establishment, you had Wall Street, you had Silicon Valley, you had Hollywood, you had intelligence agencies, you had the Soroses and the Rockefeller money, you had Washington's establishment, and needless to say, you had the New York financiers. These are the people who were behind Hillary Clinton. And behind Donald Trump, you had the Rothschilds, you had the British aristocracy, you had the European aristocracy, because again, remember, Trump is half Scot, half German. You had the Vatican, you had City, which is the epicenter of the British Empire, you had Singapore and Hong Kong, the city-states. And again, the reason, it's not like Trump is working and taking his marching orders from the Vatican. I'm not saying that.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that the old money, okay, not the new money who've been there for 100 years or 50 years or 200 years, but the old money have a lot to lose if we have a collapse of the global economy. And so they needed an alternative candidate who would represent their interests from a point of view of economy, from a point of view of stability, from a point of view of growth. You call it an isolationist or an industrialist. So what I explained before, if between 44 and 91, you had the war between the liberal banking financier order, the Western capitalist model, and the socialist Soviet-led model, beginning in 1991, with the Soviet model fusing itself into the Western model, the fight began within the Western capitalist model between the liberal financiers, the people who play with numbers on a computer, the parasites who don't produce anything at all, and the industrialists. And the fight you see today, globally, not only in the United States, but globally, is between these two groups. And we don't know who is going to win. And one of the problems we have globally, because there is no alternative economic model, and to create a model, you need somebody who won. And in 44, the people who won World War II, they created a model with the dollar as the control mechanism of the reserve currency for the entire world. But today, we don't have a winner yet, a clear winner. And with the elections this week, less so. But what we do have is a lot of uncertainty.
Okay. Well, I got to say, this is an amazing story behind the scenes. And you've had a relationship with Putin. You've worked with him before, right? So you know what you're talking about as far as his interest.
I was with Putin actually the day before. He spoke to Donald Trump way back in January 2017 when Trump became president of the United States. We discussed a lot of different things, and some of the things at the time they simply weren't possible, to make the president of the United States know some of these elements, because he just won the presidency and he wasn't even sworn in yet. But the thing is that what basically people have to understand about Putin is all this nonsense you hear in the Western liberal banking financier supported and financed media, who want to portray Putin as this KGB-eating Ruski assassin who kills journalists in the morning and then, eats them for lunch or dinner. Okay, this is absolute nonsense. Putin is a right-wing conservative, as Donald Trump, because again, you have to remember one thing: that Putin, as the president of the Russian Federation, only controls a foreign policy. National policy is controlled by Prime Minister and the Economic Council. And the Prime Minister of Russia, Medvedev, and the Economic Council, everyone from the director of the Russia Central Bank would be the same position as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And the entire Economic Council of Russia is controlled directly by International Monetary Fund, which is why until Trump's elections, again, remember, Putin's been there since the year 2000. And he was powerless to eliminate. One of the things people always ask me is, if these people are working directly for the International Monetary Fund, why doesn't Putin just fire them? He was powerless to fire them up until the election of Donald Trump, because had he eliminated whether it's the director of the Russia Central Bank or any of the other Economic Council members or ministers, that would have been a declaration of war against direct interests of the liberal elite in Russia, which means they would have cut Russia's access to SWIFT, the same as they've just done to Iran, amongst many other things, leaving Putin with only one reply: a thermonuclear war. And so sanctions that you're seeing against Putin, and you're going to see more of that because, again, with the Democrats winning the House of Representatives, there's going to be a lot more of these shenanigans, not because Putin is bad, but because the agenda of not only the Democrats, but the liberal banking financiers is to make sure that the old system, which is now in the process of collapse, stays, as long as possible in place. And again, sanctions against Putin is just such a resource. Putin's demonization.
Well, hold on a second. I want everybody to know who we're talking to. It's Daniel Estulin, investigative journalist. His new book, In the Shadows of the Presidency. And he is responding to you're kind of getting into a whole lot of things that are offshoots to the original question that I find fascinating. But I wanted people to know who they were listening to. And I do want to get to other things before we run out of time. So just finish up your point on that question, and then we can move on.
Okay, Putin's demonization, again, and sanctions as an element of total demonization, has become the main tool for preparing for these elections and also organizing possible impeachment of Trump, because the problem with both the Republicans and Democrats who are against Trump is that Trump doesn't let them keep their agenda. That agenda is controlling the emission center, which is controlling this machine that they have in the United States that prints money. Okay, because now Trump controls it. And without controlling that machine, their model can't survive, because it's a deficient model, and it doesn't give them any kind of a profit anymore. So if you don't demonize Putin, again, you have no chance of getting rid of Trump. And now with Trump winning the Senate but losing the House of Representatives, we're going to see how these shenanigans are going to play out in a short term.
Daniel, let's do this. I'm going to throw out a subject. You just respond as much as you want, and we'll move on to another with the time that we have. I'm going to just bring up space, the future of space exploration.
Well, one of the things that Trump talked about is development, progress, infrastructure. I think it was in his first or in his second speech when he talked about space exploration. Space exploration is a key element because, again, if you have no growth on the planet Earth, then you have to find somehow to grow, because, again, progress and development of humanity is directly proportional to a population density. There's no such thing as infinite growth, so the whole thing, again, is shifting the control mechanism into space. Military and intelligence power and enforcement has always been core to control. The nations with navies that control the sea lanes now control the satellite lanes, traditionally control and maintain the global reserve currency. So throughout history, the financial system backed up by military power has become the dominant control system. It is more, bloodless way to engage in warfare, slavery, and also to harvest and control. And basically what we're seeing as far as space is concerned, increasingly digital systems have supported a much more high powered and invasive communication system, giving way to more treacherous financial systems. And in part, it is the role of the satellites in that communication systems that is shifting the competition into space. So again, what we're seeing right now, because there is no growth on the planet Earth, you can grow up into space because space is the final frontier. And the whole project of moon exploration, Mars exploration, these are infrastructure projects. And this is what Trump is focusing on because, again,
I know he wants to do the Space Force. He brought up the Space Force.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the loss of privacy, Big Brother, social media. I mean, society has changed all over the world. Let's talk about what's going on behind the scenes as far as manipulation, including the allegations of tampering with the election, with Russia tampering.
Well, again, I think I don't even want to talk about tampering with elections. I think both parties do it, and it's not the first time they're doing it. We can go back to Bush winning the elections back in the year 2000. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
In friendly fashion, I talked a lot in my book, Trans-Evolution, The Coming Age of Human Deconstruction, about the entire social media construct. But in friendly fashion 3.0, we voluntarily keep our intelligence agency dossier up to date. We just call it social media. We pay for a surveillance and tracking device that we carry with us. We just call it a smartphone. We pay for the utility services that put a smart meter on our homes that allows the utility and the surveillance systems to track and record our daily activities and patterns. The critical thing to understand about friendly fascism 3.0 is that it is operated by private companies and private investors whose computing and artificial intelligence resources give them the ability to harvest actionable financial intelligence from the information flows of millions, even billions of people. And so this invisible machinery is about to get an enormous infusion of invasive power with the introduction of drones on a much larger scale in the United States airspace, and also robotics throughout the economy. Add this to recent developments in DNA, nanotechnology, brain research, computer power, transhumanism, the things I talked about in my book, Trans-Evolution, The Coming Age of Human Deconstruction, men-machine projects, and, you get my drift. So friendly fascism 3.0 is on the verge of moving completely, and psychotically out of control. And again, one of the things we have to understand when we're talking about technologies is that we are on the verge of going to the sixth technological advancement, meaning big, nano, bi, info, cogno. And one of the things, going back to Trump, that Donald Trump offered Putin in their meeting in Helsinki is if Putin allows, it looks the other way and allows Trump, a free hand with Iran and disengages from Syria, then the United States will recognize Crimea, give them control of Ukraine, push oil to $200 a barrel. And Putin, very intelligently said no, because $200 a barrel oil leaves Russia making a lot of money, but it leaves you technologically behind, while the United States, that already has developed cold fusion, will go into the sixth technological advancement. A lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, not kidding.
Globally, in space, technologically speaking. And needless to say, it's, if you go back to the Stasi, to the old East German, the secret police, I mean, this whole thing with Facebook and Twitter and, the photographs people put up with their families and friends and, the social diagramming. This is Stasi's and intel agencies, wet dream come true.
Yeah.
And people do it voluntarily and for free because they think by putting photographs of their family, friends, and members, this is all for fun and good. It is not. It's a giant intelligence operation, which is why, again, whether you're looking at Facebook, whether you're looking at Twitter, whether you're looking at Google, it's a military-industrial complex running these operations globally.
That's what I say. When every time they talk about increasing the budget for the military, for tanks and planes, the war could be waged just by manipulating things on social media and hacking. You can bring a country down. You know that, and I know that. I think people are starting to realize that. And
I think few people are starting to realize that because, again, I look at the dialectic between the left and the right, and it's amazing how easily people are manipulated and controlled, on a psychological level. Because again, right now we're in global, hybrid war 5.0. The age of Gene Sharp and color revolutions, they're long gone. It is done at such subliminal level that few people realize and understand, the shenanigans and the games being played on humanity.
Well, I think of how serious it is when I hear President Trump lie and continuously lie, easily proven lies, and his base support, they don't care or they don't know it's a lie. It's
if the media has it on the front page of their newspaper, whether it's Fox, whether it's CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, or whatever media, it's got to be true. I mean, we've been taught that. Okay, it's been encrusted and we've been brain fed that information for how many generations? And people always say to you, well, if what you're saying is true, I don't see it on television.
Oh, they do, and they do. But if you say a lie long enough and loud enough and continuously, year after year, people believe it. Look at all the extreme right-wing talk show hosts. They've been given misinformation for years.
Global dialectic. The mainstream media has always been part of the world elite, which is why they're called mainstream media, and they control money. And there's a reason why they all go to Bilderberg meetings, and nobody ever talks about Bilderberg until I wrote the book.
That's right. You wrote the book, The True Story of the Bilderberg.
Yeah, and New York Times, Washington Post. I mean, they're all there. They all know what's going on. We have the documents in my book because, again, before Bilderberg came out.
But I know. Well, just one thing on when you call the liberal media or the mainstream media. There's a lot of different outlets with different points of view, and much of it is, I think, accurate. And you can't. And to me, a lot of the things when Trump says fake news, I think lots of the fake news comes from Fox News. That's the media he prefers.
But again, you have to remember that again, from the point of view of the big picture, conceptually speaking, what's the backdrop? The backdrop, you have a collapse of an economic model, which means you need an alternative. So everybody is looking for an alternative economic model, which will probably pass for dismantling of countries and creating of regional economic blocks, which means that Trump and Clinton, whoever, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. It's irrelevant as far as the economic model is concerned. There is no alternative. So everybody is going to push their version of vision for the idea of, first of all, creating this dialectic left-right, because everybody wants you to play chess. But globally, the elite don't play chess. And that's one of the things I explain in the book on Donald Trump. Because, again, people say to me, so you pro-Donald Trump? And I always tell them the same thing, Allan. I can't be pro or against Trump. I'm not American. I look at Donald Trump as a paleontologist would look at a dinosaur. I look at him, I smell him, I touch him, I examine him with a microscope, and then I make a decision and I explain, my treaty in a scientific paper. And this is what I do in this book. And what the difference between this book on Trump and all the other stuff out there about, unseemly things that Trump allegedly does in a Moscow hotel room with women of questionable character, et cetera, et cetera. These things are irrelevant as far as the big picture is concerned, because the big picture is all the stuff we're seeing right now globally, the civil war that you're seeing right now in the United States, because it is civil war. It hasn't gone to hot war, but it's a civil war.
Yeah, it is.
But you can say the same thing anywhere you look, whether it's England with Brexit, whether it's the mass migration in Europe, whether it's China, whether it's the same thing globally, because an old model, which has given benefit and growth since 1944, is now dead. And people who are middle class are now lower class. People who are lower class are now living on the street, and even the upper classes are losing their wealth. And with the collapse of the economy, people are going to be suffering and hurting a lot, not only in the United States, but globally, because the global debt, today is $4 quadrillion. That's 4 and 15 zeros, in case people are wondering, what that number is.
The Civil War, is this something Putin actually thinks is a good thing? Does this benefit him?
It's obviously better. It's not Putin, because, again, Putin is an arbiter. You have to remember that Putin, when he came and became president in the year 2000, he came as an arbiter between three very different groups who were controlling the Soviet or Russian apparatus. The former President Yeltsin, the oligarchs, and the liberals, who basically had their masters in Washington and Europe and the International Monetary Fund. Over the years, he has grown more powerful in all of them, and he has been able to pit one against the other. But Putin has the same problems that Trump has in the United States. He has no team behind him because most of the people around him are members of the liberal banking financier order, which are the same enemies that Donald Trump has, which is why Putin and Trump, if they were to meet, they would have no trouble getting along or agreeing on things. As Trump said, his meeting with Putin, it was a wonderful thing, it was a wonderful time, and it was a great meeting. The point is that for Russia, the fact that the United States government is now divided, with the Democrats controlling the House and the Republicans controlling Senate, globally it's bad because you can have a lot of old animosities against Russia only going to get worse. But also, on the other hand, you're going to have all these people fighting each other, which means that less attention is going to be paid to Russia. Also, had Trump won clearly, both in the House and the Senate, that would have been easier for him and Putin to reach some kind of a common or find some kind of a common agenda, which would have antagonized China. Now, that being not the case, the situation is that China is probably not going to be antagonized, so the Russians and the Chinese can work together against the interests, not of Trump, but of this liberal banking financier order. As the Chinese proverb said, we're living in very interesting times.
Wow. As always, compelling information from Daniel Estulin. His website is, I believe it's english.danielestulin.com, correct?
And my Twitter feed is @EstulinDaniel.